It was his mom and dad. I'm just kidding. It wasn't really his mom and dad. They wouldn't even clap for him. I want to pick up week number 4 of our series called Understanding the Bible. Would remind you, as I'm going to every time that I teach, that we're not trying to interpret the Bible for you. We're not trying to interpret the Bible for you. We're just simply giving you the structure of the Bible, giving you an idea, kind of a basic overview of how it's all put together. Because I think once you know how it's put together, then you can interpret it. Then you can read it and understand, I'm reading a history book, or I'm reading a prophecy book, or a book of poetry, whatever the case might be. So just want to remind you of that's kind of where we're headed, just a structure. Let me ask this question. By nature, we desire things that we cannot have. By nature, we desire things that we cannot have. You agree or disagree with that statement? By nature, we desire to have things that we cannot have. Yes? By nature, one of the things that we desire to have is this thing called total freedom. Total freedom. Now, this could come across as a trick question. I don't mean it to come across that way, but do you think total freedom is reality? Why would you say no, Michael Aaron?
Because, we got laws, and you can't just go around naked killing people.
Did you say naked killing people?
Yeah.
Why can't it just be killing people? I mean, why naked killing people?
Why not? If we have total freedom.
Well, that's true. That's true. I asked the question because when we seek freedom, that freedom really brings us into, I'm going to call it bondage, and I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way. For instance, how many would like to have freedom from cavities? Freedom from cavities. Well, you know what that means? Bondage to the toothbrush. Right? If you want freedom from the toothbrush, you're going to be in bondage to cavities. And so when we ask for things to have that total freedom, what we need to understand is that total freedom does not, listen carefully what I'm telling you, does not exist. Total freedom does not exist. In the things of Christianity, give me an example of how I would mean that. Total freedom really doesn't exist. Give me an example in Christianity.
We've got laws of sin.
Yes. What about the one that says to if I want to be first, I have to be. If I want to lead, I need to follow or serve. If I want to live, I got to die. Right? So I mean, when we seek out this thing called total freedom, it's really not there. Because if I surrender my nature, then I'm going to become a slave to God. Right? I want to become a servant to God. And that's kind of where we're headed in this structure of the Bible. We have Israel. They've come out of Egypt. Last week, Holly did a great job of talking about the return as far as the conquest and Joshua going into the promised land. And then all of a sudden we entered into that period of the Judges where God kind of set some people over the nation of Israel to judge them, to help lead them. And that happened for about 400 years. And then we're going to enter into this period of time called kingdom, the kingdom era. That's the next era that we're headed. And what we're going to find out is that what the children of Israel really wanted was total freedom. But what they really got was they found themselves in pursuing the total freedom, found themselves in bondage. So before we get to that era, let's just take a quick look at where we're at as far as the chart. And if you haven't been coming, this is a good way to kind of catch up. What we're doing is we're breaking the Bible down. Right now we're in the Old Testament books of history, and we're talking about what era it is, and who is the central figure, where that location is at, and what's the storyline of that particular era. So the first era was the era of creation. I'm not going to hit the button so quick next time. The central figure is Adam, right? Took place in Eden, and the storyline is basically the creation of the world. Then you entered into a time, called the patriarchs. I don't know if this thing's going to work or not. Central figure is Abraham. It took place in Canaan. Remember, the Promised Land, or that area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, was Canaan until the kingdom. We're going to see it change now to Israel, but up until that time it was Canaan, and it's the birth of the Hebrew people. What's the simple definition or the simple explanation as to why God chose them? Because He wanted to. Because He wanted to. Abraham said, I think there's a God that can be intensely involved in my life. Instead of just being a rock and a stone that people bow down to, he followed God, and God said, I'm going to bless you, and your people will become a nation of people that so many that can't count. And He did that. The simple explanation, He did that because He could. He chose them because He could. So then you enter into that next, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done all that. The birth of Hebrew people through the family of the patriarchs, covering a period of about 200 years. Then the Exodus, which is where Holly picked it up last week. Central figure is Moses, took place in Egypt. Moses delivers the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt and then gives them the law. Where did he get the law? From God. Where was he? Mount Sinai. Because so there's some geography that we need to kind of keep our minds aware of as well. And then the last area I'm going to have to get some batteries. The conquest. That's when Joshua led the people, right, to conquer the Promised Land when they moved in. What was the first battle? Jericho. How did they fight that? And someone other than Michael Aaron, how did they fight the Battle of Jericho? Because I know you know.
They walked around the wall one time. On the seventh day, they walked around 7 times, and the priests blew their trumpets.
So they were instructed to walk around one time every day for 6 days, right? On the 7th day, they were instructed to walk around 7 times and then shout and break the pitchers. And so what they saw was a daily degradation of the wall, right? Daily, as they walked around one time, part of the wall would fall down.
No.
That's not what happened? Man, you took my notes right off the iPad. We got to understand that we sometimes don't always see what God's doing. We just have to be faithful, right? To obey, the Bible says in 2 Samuel 5:21, to obey is better than to sacrifice. You got to obey, and that's what they were doing. One time, and Holly made the point last week, but I just thought, in my mind, I just think it would be awesome if I could have been a fly on the wall when Joshua is sitting there with all the generals of his army, right? And they're getting pumped up, man. They're sharpening their swords and their spears, and Joshua, I got the plan. I spoke to the Lord. He gave me what we're going to do. We're going to walk around the walls, and we're not going to say a word. And I can imagine, just those generals, can you imagine? Like, okay, maybe he's lost it, and we need to take a vote for a new leader. And again, there's a lesson to learn there, isn't it? When God sets somebody over a people, and He has a plan, the best thing we can do is be obedient to the plan. And what happened on that 7th day? Around 7 times, and walls imploded, just went down. But that wasn't the end of it, was it? The walls fell down, and everybody in Jericho just said, okay, we're sorry, we surrender. No, there was still a war to be fought, right? So you got to keep all those things in mind as you remember what the people of Israel went through. And then the last one that Holly covered was the Judges, which the central figure there is Samson. I know he may not have been the best judge, right? Probably wasn't the best judge, but he's the most popular judge. That was the most popular judge of the era, was Samson. And then, again, it happened in Canaan. Samson and others are chosen as judges to govern God's people for about 400 rebellious years. And that brings us up to tonight. I want to jump into what we call the kingdom era. The kingdom era. The central figure would be very good, David. Greatest king that Israel had. To this day, they will say that. Expanded the territory, grew the nation, strong military. It took place in now what we call Israel. They actually have a place. It's not just Canaan now, it's Israel. And you can find the story of the kingdom era between 1 Samuel through 2 Chronicles. And as a matter of fact, you'll see a lot of repetition in there where the Bible kind of repeats itself. Some of the stories are in there twice. And here's the storyline summary. David, the greatest king in the new monarchy, is followed by a succession of mostly unrighteous kings. And God eventually judges Israel for her sin, sending her into exile. So we're going to start out with the kingdom having some kings, but where we're going to end is in that next era, which will be the exile era, as they are punished for their unrighteousness, unrighteous living. And there's four particular things about this era that we need to understand. One of them is that we started out with a united kingdom. They were all together. They were one. And as you know, David was not the first king of Israel. Who was the first king? Saul. What happened with Saul? Somebody tell me what happened with Saul.
He wasn't good.
He was not a good king. He was not a righteous king, was he? He didn't follow the things of God. And because of that, God not only didn't honor Saul as king, but he did not allow his family to succeed him, which was the thing to do. You would have a son to take the throne when you die. That didn't happen. Instead, God sent Samuel out, right, and finds David. And David, even though David had his problems, right? Can I get amen? David had his problems. He was a man after God's own heart. And he mostly was a righteous king that feared the Lord and did the right things. And because of that, the Lord blessed him. And his son, Solomon, became the second king, or the third king of Israel. So you have this united kingdom that starts, but then Solomon rules pretty good for a while, but then he goes south. He becomes an unrighteous king towards the end of his ruling, and what that leads to is a civil war. Israel has a civil war, and that brings us to the second part of the expansion of the kingdom era, and that is a divided kingdom. Start out with a united kingdom, but then you go into a divided kingdom. You find that in 1 Kings. Because of Solomon's drifting away from the things of God, you have this civil war, and the kingdom becomes divided. You have a northern kingdom, which is made up of 10 tribes of Israel, and they keep the name Israel. And then you have a southern tribe, or a southern kingdom, made up of the last 2 tribes, and they take on the name Judah. Now, this northern kingdom is going to be a kingdom that's not going to be a good kingdom. As a matter of fact, we'll read about it in just a minute, but they're going to end up on the wrong end of things. The northern kingdom has this name Israel. Southern kingdom has this name Judah. And then from the united kingdom to a divided kingdom, you have these two called the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. You can read about the northern kingdom in 2 Kings, and here's what happens. There are 19 kings in the northern kingdom during the 250-year lifetime of that kingdom. 19 kings, and none of them were righteous. None of them were good kings. None of them did the things that they needed to do. And what happened is that eventually, the northern kingdom is dispersed into the 4 winds. As a matter of fact, you can Google, if you want, the lost tribes of Israel, and what will come back is this northern kingdom. They were conquered by Assyria, but eventually they just kind of go away. You don't really ever hear about them again. As a matter of fact, there's one religion that claims to be the lost tribes of Israel. Not sure that they're legit, but they can claim that, I guess, if they want to. So you have this northern kingdom that lasts for about 250 years and didn't have any good kings. And then you have the southern kingdom that lasted a little bit longer. As a matter of fact, they had 20 kings, and that was over a little bit longer period because it was about 400 years. But the problem with the southern kingdom was, out of all those kings, out of 20 kings, only 8 of them are righteous. Only 8 of them are righteous. So Judah's sin or unrighteousness kind of catches up with them, and they're taken by the Babylonians. All right, so let's just stop long enough to look at this picture. Children of Israel are in Egypt. Moses leads them out. They wander around what was an 11-day journey, took 40 years because of disobedience and rebellion. They come to the Promised Land. Joshua leads the conquest of the Promised Land. They get in there and they're ruled by judges because God wanted to be their king. And then the people began to cry, we want a king because all the nations around us have kings. And God said, no, I want to be your king. And they said, yeah, but we want to be like everybody else. I don't know if this sounds familiar to anybody. We want to be like everybody else. So God said, all right, you can be like everybody else, you get a king. And what happened? United kingdom, divided kingdom, lost tribes, captivity, judgment, because of their rebellion, because of them not being righteous. And so Assyria conquers the northern kingdom. The Babylonians conquer the southern kingdom. What you need to kind of remember too, though, is that the Babylonians had conquered Assyria. I know it might sound just a little confusing, but Israel is conquered by Assyria. Sometime in there, Assyria is conquered by Babylon or Babylonia, and then Judah, that southern tribe, is taken into exile by the Babylonians. At that time, by the time the southern kingdom is taken into exile, Babylonia is the most powerful nation on earth. I mean, they've conquered everybody. But that's not going to be the end of the story, of course, but that's kind of where they're at. So you have the kingdom. That's coming out of the judges. You had a divided kingdom, a united kingdom, divided kingdom, the northern and southern kingdom. And that leads us into the next era, which is called the... Yeah, you looked up there. Okay, now I'm not going to touch the button. The name of the era is the exile. Who do you think the central figure of the exile is? Daniel. Daniel. Where did it take place? I gave that away. Right, Babylon or Babylonia. And you can read about that in the books of Ezekiel through Daniel. All right, now here's the summary. Daniel gives leadership and encourages faithfulness among the exiles for the next 70 years. You need to fill those blanks in. Daniel gives leadership and encourages faithfulness among the exiles for the next 70 years. I'm not a smart man, but I do know. Okay, Gary, where you at? But I do know this. The laws of physics basically tell us that things tend to run down. Unless new energy or new life comes, things tend to deteriorate. I mean, that's just a natural law of physics. And what happens is that our actions, your actions and my actions, have repercussions to those actions, have consequences to those actions. And sometimes, if we're not careful, sin, which is a fact in the human existence, I mean, it's real. It's something that we're born into thanks to great grandma and grandpa Adam and Eve. And if we're not careful, we will find out that those actions that we make that miss the mark, that's what sin is, missing God's mark, are going to have repercussions to them. And that's what we see happening in the children of Israel. Children of Israel could have made good decisions. I mean, think about it. They could have done the right things. But because of their continual rebellion and continual living unrighteously, continually ignoring the law of God, God punishes them. God has a consequence of that. One of them was that the Assyrians conquers the northern kingdom, and now the Babylonians have come to take the southern kingdom, and they take them into 70 years of exile, but they have some people that can still help them, encourage them, give them leadership, tell them about the things of God, if they'll just listen. And we know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is during this period of time, during the Babylonian captivity. They were pressured to bow down to the king. You remember that, Nebuchadnezzar, right? But they said, no, we're not going to. Well, we're going to throw you in the furnace. So, well, we don't care. Throw us in. Because we know God can save us. And even if he doesn't, we're still not bowing down to you. Now, that's a real quick summary of that story. But oh, how I wish we could have that kind of fortitude. That kind of resolve to say, listen, world, you can pressure me all you want, but I'm not bowing down. I'm going to serve the Lord. You can call me what you want. Call me a Jesus freak. Call me this, call me that, but I'm still going to serve the Lord. I'm still going to do the right thing because I know if I make bad decisions, that's going to bring bad consequences into my life. And I want to try to do the best I can to prevent that from happening. So I'm not bowing down. And I just wish we had some people that would do that. They would just say, listen, I'm not bowing down. I won't do it. I don't care what you say. I don't care what you call me. And what happens with Israel is because of their disobedience, they taste this bitter reality of the simple fact of the Lord taking them and giving them the consequence, giving them a repercussion for their decision, for their action. And so the debt was so great, God sends judgment. They're taken captive by military conquest. And that is the exile era. That's what happened. They were militarily defeated. And they're taken into captivity. And so we got to remember that there's some history in some of the prophecy books, which is what Daniel through Ezekiel is. They're books of prophecy. But there is some history in there, and that's what we find the exile era. And it's broken down also into 4 basic areas or basic events, basic people, if you will. One is prophecy. This is the warning that Jeremiah gives them of this captivity. 722 BC, the northern kingdom taken captive. And it's not till 586 BC that the southern kingdom is taken captive. But even in that time, they received all kinds of warnings. You know, if you'll just stop and serve the Lord, if you stop and do the right things. But they continue to ignore God, they continue to ignore the things of God, and what happens eventually is God then has them taken into exile. And so they ignore the prophecies of the Lord, and they didn't listen to the prophets. But once they're into exile, it's the prophets that begin to encourage them. Let's be faithful. To encourage them, let's start looking at the things of God. Ezekiel and Daniel both were trying to give the people a good example. We don't really know that much about Ezekiel. His book's not an autobiography. It's more of a book of prophecy. So we really don't know much about him. He tells the nation that if they're faithful, they'll be restored. If they do the right things, the Lord will bring them out. But we really don't know anything about him. But Daniel's book includes some of his biography, right? Which we know him best because of the lion's den, right? Daniel and the lion's den. Right? So we have a little bit of history or biography, if you will, of Daniel. We really don't know that much about Ezekiel. We know that Daniel was a leader. He was one of the smart guys. Because when the Babylonians went to take the southern kingdom captive, they grabbed all the smart people and all the good people because they were going to make them part of the leadership, if you will, in Babylon. But they ran into some guys that said, no, we're not going to bow. Remember that. We're not going to bow. And so you have a prophecy that says this is what's going to happen. You have prophets that say, listen, if you can just live righteously, some good things can happen. And then you have the exiles. That's the 4th group, if you will, during that era. And here's what happened to the exiles. They assimilated into the Babylonian culture. Just when I say that to you, when I say God's people assimilated into the culture of the Babylonians, just tell me what comes to mind. What are you thinking when I say that? Say it again. They bowed down. They bowed down. What is assimilated? When one culture assimilates into another culture, what does that mean? What happens there? Huh? They blend in. Yeah, there's 2 belief systems there, right? Somebody's going to compromise, or one's going to lay it down, the other's going to keep running, right? That's what happened to the exiles. There's only 70 years that they're there, but Daniel gives us a little glimpse of what happens to them. And apparently, from what Daniel says, these Jewish people, God's chosen people, decided rather than to stand up, rather than to do the right thing, what they did is they just said, okay, we're just going to kind of shoulder up with these Babylonians, and we're going to kind of become like them. And, the parallel there is obvious, isn't it? I mean, you don't really need to spend a lot of time talking about that. It's obvious. That's not the way to be. It's not just going with the flow. It's just not doing it what everybody else is doing it just because everybody else is doing it. It's about being able to stand up for the right things. And even though some of the Hebrew people achieved some very high positions in the Babylonian government and in leadership there, it still was this sad story that after 70 years, after just 70 years, the younger generation had to be retaught the things of God because they'd never heard anything about God. And again, the parallel there to what we experience today is incredible. Incredible. It's amazing to me that statistics tell us that of these young people that are sitting in here, the ones who do not accept the Lord by the age of 18, the chances that they will after that, they drop so drastically. So drastically. And why? It's because we have a culture that doesn't even really believe the things of God anymore. You can leave tonight and call me whatever you want to call me. That's fine. I'm not going to bow down anyway. But this was a country that was founded on a Christian ethic. It was founded by virtuous people, good people. And it's the virtuous things about us that make us a good country. Virtue is not really something that you can go to the store and buy. Virtue is a decision that you make. When you go up here to this stop sign, you stop there not because there's a cop sitting there. You stop because you know it's the right thing to do. And that's virtue. That's what virtue is. Just knowing the right things and then doing it. And the problem is when we're not virtuous, when we don't do good things. And that's kind of what's going on with the children of Israel. They've kind of lost the virtue. They've kind of lost the good, and they've just kind of moved into that culture in Babylon and kind of become like a Babylonian. Let's not stir the water. Let's not ripple anything. Let's just kind of live here. And that's the problem. That's the problem in America. We don't want to cause no trouble. We don't want to make no waves. We're just going to kind of blend in. And there's a problem with that. And the problem with that is, in 70 years, there's going to be a generation that doesn't know anything about God. Do you know that of the young people that are between the ages of 5 and 16 today, right now, this moment, you know the percentage of them that believe the Bible to be the absolute truth? 4%. 4. Think about that. Now we say, well, it's not that way here. Well, of course it's not that way here. This is church. But how many 6 to 16-year-olds are not here tonight? Or not in a church anywhere? And when you do the research, Barna did the research, 4% believe the Bible to be the absolute truth. If the Bible is not the plumb line of moral rightness, what is? What is? It's going to be everything else. It's going to be whatever the world tells them it's going to be. It's going to be whatever Hollywood tells them it's going to be. And when you start saying, no, this is black and white. This is right and wrong. No, not so much. It is what's wrong with I think that, probably shouldn't say this. I think the Antichrist is already here. What do you think about that? I think he's already here. I think it's called secular humanism. It's look out for yourself. Just do what's best for you. That's as anti-Christ as you can be. Say it.
They tried that one before.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it didn't. Because there is a way that seems right to a man, but the end is death, right? And I'm just saying, look, we can learn from history. We can learn from history. And if we don't learn from history, we're going to repeat it. And what a shame it would be to repeat that history. For the Lord to, it's not, how many, I'm not going to, there's a lot of people in the room that are over 50, I know. When I was in, thanks, Gary. When I was in, actually, until I graduated high school, I didn't think there was no way that the United States would ever fall to anybody. We were the greatest power on earth. We were the strength. I don't know about you. I don't feel that way anymore. I don't feel like that anymore. And so the reason you say, well, why do you want to say that? Try to scare? No, I'm saying the Lord can have a military action against us just like He did there. I mean, we're not protected against that. As a matter of fact, I will say this, and it will scare some. You can read the revelation of Jesus Christ. You don't really find the United States in there anywhere. You don't find the United States in that end time prophecy. I wonder why. Could it be that we're just not here? I mean, that's a sad thought. Again, when I was a senior in high school, that thought would have never entered my mind. Oh, no, no, no. You mess with us, bing, we'll take care of you. But it's not that way anymore. And so you say, well, why are you saying all that? I'm saying that because we need some people that will stand up for what's right and be virtuous people again. I've been accused. I gotta get through this. I've been accused of being political. I'm not a political pundit. If I say abortion's wrong, that's not a political statement. That's a moral statement. If I say that we don't believe in alcohol use or tobacco use, that's not a political statement. That's a moral statement. That's what our church believes, okay? Is everybody with me? Everybody with me? When virtuous people don't do the right things anymore, a government steps in and says, we will do the right things for you because you can't do it. And I don't care who's sitting in the White House. That's what they'll do. And so what do we need people that will rise up and do the right things. Why do we need disasters to bring us together? Are hurricanes going to listen? I don't want to get into the conversation about climate change or none of that. You do the research yourself. 1940 had more hurricanes than we did today. You do the research yourself. I already did it, but you do it yourself. And so it's not about that. It's about why do we need those things to bring us together? Why do we need 9/11 to happen? And wasn't that awesome? I mean, it was a tragic thing that brought our country together, and everybody was going around, God bless America, God bless America, for about 2 weeks. You know, until it kind of wore off. And man, I gotta quit. We got revisionists that want to tell us that didn't even happen, you know. The Holocaust didn't even happen. Those 6 million Jews, they didn't die. And we just need people to stand up and do the right thing. Say the right things. Do the right things. Be the right person. It doesn't matter what everybody else thinks. Just be the right person. You can't go wrong doing the right thing. All right, I'll move on. The exiles, they decided to assimilate. That was a problem. And the problem really happened because the Babylonians were not God-fearing people, right? Nebuchadnezzar builds a 90-foot statue and wants everybody to bow down to that, not to God. But God punishes Babylon, right? How does he punish Babylon? Well, yes, that's true. They were also taken over by military action. It does, and that's a great sermon. We don't want to preach it, but it does say, like the prodigal, when he came to his senses and he understood that he wasn't all that he thought he was. But what happened is God then sends judgment to the Babylonians by a power change. There was another country that began to rise up called the Persians. And the Persians defeated the Babylonians. Now remember, who did the Babylonians defeat? Assyria, right? So the Babylonians defeat Assyria, but Persia defeats the Babylonians. So now Persia's become the strongest country or the strongest nation on the planet. And I think it's because God decided things were going to change. And this Persian Empire begins to expand. And it expands from the Tigris River. Remember the Tigris and the Euphrates, where we think Eden was at? Well, their empire expands from there to the Mediterranean Sea. And guess what happens to lie about 34 miles in from the Mediterranean Sea? Israel, right? The Promised Land. And the Persians have taken that over. And so we're going to see in the next era, after we look at this geography, about the return. But here's what happened, and you should make note of this because it's going to be on your test. I'm just saying. You can see that Assyria and Babylon, or the Babylonians, they were all conquered by the Persians. The Persians are the ones that are in charge now. They're the ones that are in control. They're the ones that have conquered everybody else. And because of that, we enter into another era, and that era is called the return era. Come out of the Exodus, you have the conquest, then you have the kingdoms, and out of the divided kingdoms, you have the exile, but from the exile, you have a return. If I said to you, can you see God's plan in all this? How do you see God's plan in all this? How do you see it? Kind of, yes, kind of, a little bit. The Persians are definitely in the plan, aren't they? Right? I mean, Assyria thought they were going to be the greatest nation. They were going to last forever. They thought they were going to be Rome, if you will. But then they get conquered. And the Babylonians think we're great. But then they get conquered. They get conquered by a group or a nation called the Persians. But the Persians expand their territory over to where Israel's at. And it just so happens that there's a group of people, right, that are in exile in a place that's been conquered now by the Persians, and the Persians kind of look at them kind of with some favor. That's why we need to understand that God is the one who's in control. Doesn't matter who's sitting on the throne. Doesn't matter who's in the White House. God's in control. God's in control. Because He turns the hearts of men. The Persians conquered the unconquerable, but they did it. And they did it expanding the territory to include this promised land. And there's some people there that want to go back to the promised land. So this return era, we can read about it from the book of Ezra to Esther. And the central figure there is Ezra. He's another prophet, another leader of the Jewish people. And the central place is Jerusalem. Jerusalem. Because that's where they're going to get sent back to. That's where they're going to return to, is Jerusalem initially. And here's your summary. Ezra leads the people back from exile to rebuild Jerusalem. To rebuild Jerusalem. Ezra leads the exiles, leads them out of the exile to rebuild Jerusalem. How long did I tell you that they were in exile in Babylon? 70 years. They've only been there 70 years, so they're going to return. And how many know that in 70 years it's a different group of people that return than the ones who left? Right? It's a different group of people. And so they went in really kind of confused. This new group of people come to Jerusalem not really understanding the importance of this is Jerusalem. This is where the temple was that's been destroyed. That's been militarily destroyed. And so these people don't really see that. They've been in solitude. They've been in exile. They've been assimilating into another culture. And then when God allows them to go back, they're kind of confused. They don't really know what to think. They don't really know what to do. They've been pulled out of what was home, but taken back to a place that really was their home, really was the land that God gave to them. And so they've got to go back there and prepare the place to worship Jehovah, the real God. But they're just a little bit confused. And so there's some things, 4 major subjects that happen in this era. One of them is what we call disrepair. Disrepair. That simply means that there's so much destruction from war and from neglect and from people not being there. There's so much destruction that during that 70 years, Jerusalem just falls into disrepair. It's a place that needs to be bulldozed in today's term, if you want to think of it that way. It's a wasteland. And during that 70 years, it's not just from the ravages of the military conquest, but the simple fact that there's neglect, there's nobody that lives there. And so they return to a place that they don't really recognize anymore. They may have heard about it, right? Some of their ancestors, some of their fathers and grandfathers may have told them about this great place called Jerusalem, in the promised land called Israel, but they had never been there, most of them. And so they arrive at this place and they're kind of confused. Because it's laying in such disrepair, they don't understand what the grandeur of it all is. What's the big deal about this? And so somebody's got to tell them about the temple. The temple. The temple has become the central focus of Hebrew worship. As a matter of fact, it still is to this day. The temple is the central focus of the Hebrew worship. But that temple had been destroyed. But here's what happened. As the children of Israel are in exile, first in Babylon, then in Persia, God moves on the heart of King Cyrus, king of Persia. He moves on the king's heart to not just let the people go back, but to finance it. to finance and rebuild the temple and the city of Jerusalem. Now, the Persians were not God-fearing people. The Persians weren't worshiping Jehovah, but God moved on the heart of Cyrus to finance these people going back. I say that because it doesn't matter who's sitting in that position of authority. God's in charge. God's the one that's in charge. And so under the direction of a guy named Zerubbabel, the rebuilding of the temple begins. And even though there's considerable opposition by the people who have now inhabited Israel, which are not Hebrew people, it's a bunch of Gentile people, a bunch of people that were not Jewish, if I could say it that way. There's a bunch of people there, and so there's some opposition, and they try to stop the work, they try to come against the work. But when virtuous people will do the right thing and follow the plan of God, His will get accomplished. His will be done. And that's what happened here. Because Haggai and Zechariah, a couple other prophets during that time, they encourage the people, they lead the people, they get the people to do the right thing, and the temple is completed. So they come back from exile, the place is in disrepair, but because of the financing of a foreign king, the temple gets rebuilt, and then there's another segment that needs to be rebuilt, and that's the people. The people now need to be rebuilt, a spiritual rebuilding, if I could say it that way. You see, there's a parallel between the temple being rebuilt and the people being rebuilt, right? There's a parallel there. There's been no temple worship for 70 years. Most of the Jewish people that returned had not heard the law of Moses, and so now there's this national re-education program. They've got to learn it all over again. And Ezra sets his heart to study the law of the Lord so that he can teach the people so that they can be re-educated about the things of God. And again, I see all of that parallel with us today. I mean, is it time? Is it time for us to re-educate the people of God? I mean, we've heard all the other doctrines, haven't we? You know, if you just believe right, you can have a Mercedes in the driveway, and if you just do the right thing, you'll never be sick. And we've heard all these doctrines and things that are just things that we've heard. But isn't it time for somebody to stand up and say, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that if you would just believe on Him, you're not going to perish, but you'll have everlasting life." Isn't it time for somebody to stand up and say, if we will just confess our sins, He's faithful and just to forgive us? Isn't it time for someone to stand up and say, you know what? Lying is wrong. It's not about the definition of a word. Lying is wrong, period. Isn't it time for someone to stand up and say, let's not worship other gods. Let's just worship the one and only God. Let's not take God's name in vain. And just a little side note. We got to quit, but just a little side note. Taking the name of the Lord in vain doesn't necessarily mean words that come out of your mouth. When Vicki and I got married, her name changed to Vicki Wagner. And when we had children, they were given the Wagner name. And when any of us do things that are contrary to being good, we kind of take the Wagner name in vain. So it's not just words that come out of your mouth. Sometimes taking the name of the Lord in vain is doing the wrong things. Because when you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord, you're a child of God. You represent Him to the world. And when you make wrong decisions, you do the wrong thing, that's to me, and we can theologically arm wrestle if you want to, but to me, that's taking the name of the Lord in vain. We take it to do the right things. We take it to be virtuous people. We take it to try to live right and be disciples of Christ. We don't take it to do things that we used to do when we were outside of His love and His grace and His mercy. Let's throw that out there just for the fun of it. So Ezra sets his heart. He re-educates the people. But there's this thing called walls that they need. Because there was a wall around Jerusalem. And while all these people have returned to Jerusalem, not all of them did. The book of Esther is about Esther who stayed in Persia. I mean, so not all of them returned. You can read the book of Esther to read about some of those Jews that didn't return. Matter of fact, if you'll remember, Haman wanted there to be a law that was going to get all of the Jewish people killed again. Right? He's going to have that happened in Persia. That didn't happen in Jerusalem. That happened while they were still in exile. So the temple gets restored. There's this dominant structure now in the city that people can look to, but the walls of the city are still in disrepair. The walls of the city are still torn down, and there's just kind of a national humiliation about that, because they now were exposed, if you will. They didn't feel like that they were the nation or the country that they once were. So there's this concern. And so what happens is, you read the book of Nehemiah. What did Nehemiah do? Somebody who's a Bible scholar. He built the wall. He started to get the walls built, right? And he was the one talked about the watchman, and so he begins to rebuild the walls. And guess who finances the walls being rebuilt? Say it. Yeah, and those Persian kings again. Yeah, I say it again. I believe that's correct. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And again, I mean, look at how that happens. They're in exile, and then someone says, "Hey, we're going to return back to Jerusalem. We're going to rebuild the temple," but not everybody goes. The ones who stay, though, God still has a plan there. Right? And he works that plan. I just think God's so cool. So the restoration's complete. The walls get built. And it's all paid for by the people in Persia. That's kind of a good deal. And they're there. And now the temple has become the central focus of their worship. Because that's the Hebrew way of worshiping God. It was about the temple. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to attend a Jewish service. I have. And I mean, when it comes to just the allness of it all, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. It's unfortunate that they don't believe in Jesus as the Son of God. I tried to win Rabbi Witcher over to Christianity, but it didn't work. And matter of fact, I probably have told you this before. I did a paper comparing and contrasting Christianity with Judaism. And Rabbi Witcher happened to be the professor in the class, and I decided I was going to interview him to get, to do the paper. And so I, talk about God, and we, same things, agree, God, Abraham, yes. And I said, well, what about Jesus? And I'm telling you, this is almost word for word. He said, we believe Jesus was a good teacher and prophet, small case P. He specifically said, small case P. But if you think of him more than that, then you really leave our belief system. And I thought, how sad. There's your mercy and your grace right there before you. And you missed it. But I hope maybe I planted a seed that maybe somebody else will come along and water someday. Who knows? Who knows? So here's the geography. It's pretty simple. Whoops, back up. Back up. There's the geography of the return. It's from Persia to Jerusalem. From Persia to Jerusalem. So that's 3 more eras that we've got. And if I can get Trevor and Ian to help me real quick, we can be done in 5 minutes. If you guys will pass these out. Excuse me. Woo. And it's time for that special time that we all love called the self-test. Now, I prefer that you not use your handout, but if you need to use it, use it. But why don't you try to see how much of this you kind of can recall without your handout, but if you need it, use it. We'll give you about 4 or 5 minutes to fill this out, and then we'll go over the answers and we'll be dismissed. Eras to finish up next week before we move into the New Testament. After we get through the eras, then we're going to go back and talk about some of the basic teachings of the Bible. Next week will be the silence era, the poetical era, and the prophetical era. Hey, you guys aren't supposed to be selling those. Yeah. Put it in the box. Put it in the box. Your tithe dollar at work right there. Next week I'm going to have some Jeopardy music to play right here. No sharing on answers over there. You, the principal's office, go. You, don't tell me that ain't the first time you heard that. You've heard that before. I love it when I look back and see most everybody's heads down trying to either sleep or fill out the answers. Hopefully you're filling out answers. Both. Sierra's done. She's like, yeah, I'm first one. What do I get? That's what college students do. All right, about ready to go over this real quick? I heard no, I heard sure, and I heard a snore. All right, the kingdom era. 4 main periods in the kingdom era. We need to match the period with the description. So the United Kingdom was B, a new monarchy. Divided kingdom, D, a civil war, right? Northern kingdom, A, the unrighteous kingdom. And then the southern kingdom, C, the inconsistent kingdom. Just remember, if my math is right, the southern kingdom lasted about 130 years longer than the northern kingdom. And what was the name of the southern kingdom? Judah, which means praise. If you're going to last a little bit longer, it's always better if we praise the Lord. It would give us about another 130 years. Storyline, David was the greatest king in the new monarchy. It's followed by a succession of mostly unrighteous kings, and God eventually judges Israel for her sin, sending her into exile. And then I hope you were able to draw the lines. Israel to Assyria and Judah to Babylonia. All right? Exile era, the 4 major subjects of the exile era. And we want to match the subject with the description. So prophecy would be, say it again? C. Warning of impending captivity. Prophets is D, encouraging faithfulness of the exiles. Exiles, B, assimilated into the culture, and then the power change, A, the Persian Empire. Summary is that Daniel gives leadership and encourages faithfulness for the next 70 years. Geography there is basically you need to draw a circle around Assyria and Babylonia and somehow indicate that they were captured or conquered by the Persians. And then that last era, the return era, 4 major subjects in that era. The first one, disrepair, would be C. Destruction from war and neglect. Disrepair, destruction from war and neglect. Temple, B, has kind of give it away, didn't it? Rebuilding the temple. People, A, spiritual rebuilding, and then D, walls. I never would be a good teacher, would I? Walls is D, restoration is complete. And the summary there is Ezra leads the people back to rebuild Jerusalem. And the geography there is just from Persia to Jerusalem. Give yourselves a pat on the back. Okay, look at me for just a minute. we're gonna continue this next week. I hope that this is beneficial to you. I know that when I first went through it myself, it was beneficial for me. Because I know what the Bible was. I knew, some of the things that the Bible said, but this part of it, the actually structure of the Bible, I really didn't understand. And so the first time I went through it was very beneficial for me. The second time I taught it, it even became more beneficial in my sermon prep and prepping for lessons, just to understand how this all kind of came together. And so I hope it's beneficial to you. I hope that you're gaining an understanding of how the Bible's put together, what the structure of the Bible is, who the main characters are in those eras and those locations, because I think it'll help us as we study to interpret. Anybody got a question, a comment, a concern? Anybody, anything? Gary Stapleton. Oh yeah, 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 yeah. David Martin and his Wall Builders, is that what it's called? He is really, really good. I've heard him several times. Again, be careful with this thing that's going on in our, especially in the academic world, and that is the rewriting of history. The rewriting of history that goes on to try to change the narrative of our country, to change it from the fact that we were, founded on the Judeo-Christian work ethic. We were founded on Christian principles. We were founded on virtue. I read a book. It was entitled "If You Can Keep It," and the whole book was based on something that Benjamin Franklin said. They had met in the Independence Hall, and they were trying to come up with this Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. That's what they did on July 4th, 1776. But then there was a Constitution that they came up with. And as Benjamin Franklin's walking out of the front of Independence Hall, there's a lady that walks by, and she asked Benjamin Franklin, "Well, do we have a republic or a monarchy?" Now remember what a monarchy is, right? That's what they left in England. That's what Israel had with David and the kings. She said, "Do we have a republic or a monarchy?" And Benjamin Franklin said, "A republic if you can keep it." What do you mean if you can keep it? How is a republic kept? It's not kept in a document. It's not kept on paper. It's kept by people. Virtuous people who do the right things. So he said, we've got a republic if you can keep it. And it's a really good book. I'd encourage you to read it. It's got some really good stuff in there. Anyway, thank you, Gary, for David Martin, Wall Builders. I would definitely recommend that. Barton. I said Martin, didn't I? Barton. Oh, yeah. I mean, you can look at their and we don't have time to get into it. No, well, them teachers back there, they don't want... See, you don't have any kids back there. This whole separation of church and state thing, right? It's such a farce what they've turned it into. It's not in the Constitution. Listen to me, especially if you're a young person. Separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. It's not in there. It was a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a Baptist church, of all churches, a Baptist church. A Baptist church, I forget, somewhere on the East Coast. And they were asking him a question, and he mentions that there should be a wall of separation, meaning that the government shouldn't be able to tell the church what to do. And the government shouldn't be able to tell you what church to go to. That's what it was all about. But we've turned it into take the manger scene off the public square, get the Ten Commandments off the judge's wall. I mean, we've turned it into stuff that it was never. But that happens when we allow people to be what they're called revisionists. They rewrite history. And I'm telling you, that'll be a mistake. It'll be a mistake. Let's stand. Somebody tell me, shut up. I heard that. Thank you, Lord, for this time together. Thank you for people that will sacrifice some time on a Wednesday night just to come together to worship you and then to learn about your word, to learn the structure of your Bible. I just pray that you'll take what we've learned, not just tonight, but over the last 4 weeks, and help us to have a greater understanding of your word, which then becomes that basic instructions for our life. I pray that you'll just protect us when we leave this place. Keep us safe in all that we do. We love you. Thank you for that in Christ's name. Somebody say amen. Shake someone's hand, hug someone's neck, tell them you're glad to see them in church. See you the next time.